Hey guys, tonight you're about to witness the systematic destruction of human dignity on an industrial scale. Genghis Khan is building his empire one shattered life at a time. We'll get to why captive women became the currency of conquest and terror. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. The year is 1220, and you're living in a world where entire civilizations can vanish in the span of a season. The Mongol war machine is rolling across Asia like a plague of locusts, and if you happen to be a woman in their path, your life is about to become a commodity. Let's be clear about something from the start. This isn't a story about noble warriors or romantic conquest. This is about what happens when human beings are reduced to livestock, sorted, branded, and shipped across continents like sacks of grain. The Mongols didn't just conquer territory. They harvested people. You're standing in your village on what will be the last normal morning of your life. Maybe you're in Kiev, maybe you're in Baghdad, maybe you're in some farming settlement whose name history won't even remember. The details don't matter because the outcome is always the same. The thunder you hear on the horizon isn't a storm. It's hoofbeats. The Mongol scouts arrive first. They're different from any soldiers you've ever seen. Small, compact men on horses that seem to move like extensions of their bodies. They don't wear heavy armor or carry massive swords. Instead, they're draped in layers of leather and felt, armed with recurved bows that can put an arrow through a man at 300 yards. They study your village like farmers appraising cattle. Within hours, they're gone. But they've seen everything they need to see. How many men of fighting age? How many women of childbearing years? How many children who might be worth training? The location of your grain stores, your water sources, your escape routes. You think they're just raiders passing through. You have no idea you've just been cataloged for harvest. The main army arrives 3 days later. It's not an army in any sense you understand. It's a migration of destruction, a moving city of warriors, siege engines, and support staff that stretches to the horizon. The dust cloud alone is visible for miles. When they finally crest the hills around your village, the sound is like nothing you've ever heard. Not just the thunder of hooves, but the creaking of leather, the rattling of weapons, the low humming of thousands of voices speaking in a language that sounds like wind through dry grass. Your village's defenses, such as they are, crumble in minutes. The Mongols don't waste time with dramatic charges or heroic duels. They simply surround your settlement and begin the methodical work of conquest. Arrows rain down from impossible distances. The few armed men in your village die before they can even see their attackers clearly. The wooden palisade that took your grandfather's generation years to build burns like kindling. And then comes the sorting. This is where the Mongol system reveals its true horror. They don't kill everyone. They don't even kill most people. Instead, they divide the surviving population into categories like a merchant sorting goods for market. Men of fighting age are separated first. Some are killed immediately, their heads stacked in neat pyramids as a warning to other settlements. Others, particularly those with useful skills, are marked for slavery. But it's the sorting of women that reveals the industrial nature of Mongol conquest. You're herded into groups based on age, appearance, and perceived value. The old and infirm are typically killed outright. There's no profit in feeding useless mouths. Young children are often spared, destined for adoption into Mongol families or training as soldiers. But women between the ages of 12 and 40 face a different fate entirely. The Mongols have developed a systematic approach to human trafficking that would make modern slavers envious. They count the girls and women, selecting 1 in 10 for immediate use by the army. The others are tagged and prepared for transport to the vast network of slave markets that spans the Mongol Empire. It's not random. It's not passionate. It's accounting. You watch as women you've known your entire life are reduced to inventory. Your sister, who is planning her wedding next month, is grabbed by a Mongol soldier who examines her teeth like he's buying a horse. Your neighbor's daughter, barely 14, is marked with a daub of paint that designates her for the officer's personal use. The old woman who taught you to weave is casually clubbed to death because she's too slow to keep up. This is your introduction to the Mongol concept of human value. You exist now only as a resource to be exploited. Your thoughts, your feelings, your relationships, your entire identity as a human being has been erased. You are livestock with the inconvenient ability to think. The march begins immediately. There's no time to grieve, no time to say goodbye, no time to process what has just happened to your world. You're chained to a line of other women and forced to walk behind the Mongol column as it moves toward its next target. The chains are iron, heavy enough to prevent escape, but not so heavy as to slow the march. The Mongols are practical above all else. You quickly learn that this is not a one-time raid. This is an assembly line of conquest. Every few days, the column stops at another settlement. The same process repeats. The same sorting, the same selection, the same reduction of human beings to trade goods. Your line of captives grows longer with each stop. By the end of the first week, you're chained to women who speak half a dozen different languages, all united now in the universal language of suffering. The Mongols have turned human trafficking into a science. They understand that different markets demand different types of slaves. Christian women are more valuable in Muslim territories, where their exotic nature commands premium prices. Muslim women are prized in Christian lands for the same reason. Young women with fair skin are especially sought after in the eastern markets of China and Korea. Dark-haired women with strong builds are preferred for heavy labor in the western territories. You are being processed according to algorithms of human misery that have been refined over decades of conquest. Your captors discuss your potential market value in the same tone they might use to debate the merits of different horse breeds. They examine your hands to determine if you've done manual labor. They check your teeth to estimate your age. They assess your physical development to determine your suitability for sexual exploitation. The journey to the slave markets can take months. You walk during the day, chained in a line that stretches for hundreds of yards. At night, you're penned like animals in temporary corrals made of rope and stakes. The Mongols provide just enough food and water to keep you alive and mobile. Weakness is not tolerated. Women who fall behind are killed immediately and left by the roadside as examples to the others. The psychological warfare begins immediately. The Mongols understand that broken spirits are easier to manage than defiant ones. They deliberately separate mothers from children, sisters from sisters, friends from friends. They encourage competition among the captives for the meager rations and slightly better treatment. They reward those who inform on escape attempts or acts of resistance with minor privileges that create jealousy and mistrust among the prisoners. You watch as women you once respected begin to crack under the pressure. Some retreat into complete silence, their minds shutting down to protect themselves from a reality too horrible to process. Others become frantically collaborative, desperate to please their captors in hopes of securing better treatment. A few attempt escape, only to be dragged back and tortured as examples to the rest. The sexual exploitation begins immediately and continues throughout the journey. There is no pretense of consent, no attempt to disguise rape as anything other than the systematic use of women's bodies as rewards for Mongol soldiers. The officers take first choice of the captives each night. The common soldiers draw lots for the remainder. Your body is no longer your own. It belongs to whoever holds the chain that binds you. This isn't random violence or the uncontrolled lust of conquering armies. This is policy. The Mongols have discovered that sexual terrorism is an effective tool of conquest. Word spreads ahead of their armies. Towns surrender without a fight rather than face the fate that awaits their women. Resistance crumbles when defenders know that victory is impossible and defeat means watching their daughters and wives disappear into the Mongol slave machine. The logistics of this system are staggering. The Mongol Empire maintains a network of way stations, supply depots, and processing centers that stretches from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean. Captive women are moved along these routes like cargo, sorted and resorted according to market demands. A woman captured in Kiev might end up in a brothel in Baghdad. A girl taken from a Persian village could find herself in the harem of a Chinese merchant. The Mongols have essentially industrialized human trafficking. They maintain detailed records of their captives, tracking bloodlines, skills, and physical characteristics. They breed women like livestock, attempting to produce children with desired traits. They experiment with different methods of breaking resistance, comparing the effectiveness of various forms of psychological and physical torture. You are no longer a person. You are a data point in the vast ledger of Mongol conquest. The scale of this system is almost impossible to comprehend. Conservative estimates suggest that the Mongol conquests resulted in the enslavement of over 2 million women and children. That's a number so large it becomes abstract, meaningless. But you're not a statistic. You're one individual woman whose life has been completely destroyed for the profit and pleasure of strangers. As your captive column approaches one of the major slave markets, the reality of your situation becomes even more clear. This isn't temporary. This isn't something you can endure until rescue comes or until you can escape. This is your new permanent reality. You will be sold like cattle. Your buyer will own you completely. You will work until you die or until you become too damaged to be useful, at which point you will be discarded. The slave market itself is a festival of human misery. Buyers examine you like livestock, checking your teeth, feeling your muscles, assessing your potential for various forms of exploitation. Some buyers are looking for domestic servants. Others want agricultural workers. Many are shopping for sexual slaves. A few are seeking breeding stock to produce the next generation of slaves. The Mongols have created a system so efficient, so profitable, that it becomes self-sustaining. The wealth generated by slave trading helps fund further conquests, which produce more slaves, which generate more wealth. It's a feedback loop of human suffering that spans continents and generations. But the true horror of the Mongol slave system isn't just its scale or its efficiency. It's the way it destroys not just individual lives, but entire cultures and societies. When the Mongols sweep through a region, they don't just kill people or steal property. They break the chains of cultural transmission that connect generations. Children grow up not knowing their parents' languages, religions, or traditions. Women who might have been teachers, artists, or leaders in their home communities become anonymous property in distant lands. Think again if you believe this is just ancient history. The techniques pioneered by the Mongols became the template for human trafficking that continues to this day. The industrial approach to breaking human spirits, the use of sexual violence as a weapon of control, the systematic separation of families, the commodification of human bodies based on market demand, all of these strategies were refined and perfected in the Mongol slave camps of the 13th century. You are living through the birth of modern human trafficking. The methods that destroy your life will be passed down through generations of slavers, refined and adapted, but fundamentally unchanged. The Mongol innovations in human misery will echo through history, claiming millions of victims across the centuries. The most devastating realization comes when you understand that escape is not just difficult, it's meaningless. Even if you somehow manage to break free from your chains, where would you go? Your home village no longer exists. Your family is dead or scattered across the empire as slaves themselves. Your entire culture has been erased. You are a person without a people, a survivor of a world that no longer exists. This is what the Mongols understood better than any previous conquerors. It's not enough to defeat armies or capture cities. To truly conquer a people, you must destroy their capacity to imagine themselves as anything other than victims. You must break not just their bodies, but their spirits, their cultures, their very sense of identity as human beings. The women who survived the Mongol slave system are forever changed. Even if they eventually gain their freedom, even if they manage to build new lives in distant lands, they carry the scars of their experience. They know, in ways that free people can never understand, exactly how fragile civilization really is. They know how quickly human beings can be reduced to property, how easily the bonds that hold society together can be severed. And their children carry those scars too. The trauma of slavery doesn't end with the slave. It passes down through generations, shaping families and communities in ways that are invisible but profound. The Mongol slave system didn't just destroy the lives of its immediate victims. It created ripples of damage that spread across centuries, affecting people who would never know why they carried such deep wounds. This is the true legacy of Genghis Khan's treatment of captive women. Not just the immediate horror of rape and slavery, but the long-term destruction of human potential across entire civilizations. Every woman forced into sexual slavery was also a potential mother, teacher, artist, or leader whose contributions to human culture were lost forever. Every child born into slavery was a mind that might have discovered new ideas or created beautiful things, instead condemned to a life of servitude and suffering. The efficiency of the Mongol system means that these losses were multiplied across thousands of communities and millions of individual lives. The cumulative effect was the erasure of entire ways of life, languages that disappeared without record, traditions that died with their last practitioners, knowledge that was lost when the people who carried it were scattered to the winds. You are witnessing the death of worlds, plural, not just your own small village, but the entire network of relationships, knowledge, and culture that made your community unique. The Mongols don't just conquer territory, they erase the human meaning of that territory, turning vibrant communities into empty spaces waiting to be filled with Mongol colonists. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Mongol slave system is how normal it becomes to the people who operate it. The soldiers who rape captive women each night go about their duties with the casual efficiency of farmers tending livestock. The merchants who buy and sell human beings discuss their transactions with the same commercial language they might use for any other commodity. The administrators who maintain the slave markets treat their ledgers of human misery as routine paperwork. This normalization of atrocity is what allows the system to function on such a massive scale. If the Mongols had to constantly overcome moral objections or emotional resistance to their treatment of captives, the system would break down. But by reducing human beings to property, by treating slavery as simply another aspect of commerce, they create a bureaucracy of suffering that can process millions of victims with mechanical efficiency. You experience this dehumanization not as a philosophical abstraction, but as a daily reality that grinds away at your sense of self. Every morning you wake up to the realization that your life has no inherent value to anyone around you. Your pain doesn't matter. Your fears don't matter. Your memories of a life before slavery are relevant to your current circumstances. You exist solely to serve the needs and desires of people who see you as equipment. Script continues, type continue, or just hit enter. The process of breaking human spirits requires precise timing and careful observation. Your captors have studied this art for generations, passing down techniques like family recipes. They know exactly when to apply pressure and when to ease off, how to create hope just so they can crush it. How to turn victims against each other while maintaining the illusion that cooperation might lead to better treatment. The first phase involves complete disorientation. You're moved constantly, never allowed to establish any sense of routine or familiarity. Just as you begin to recognize the faces of other captives in your chain gang, you're separated and mixed with new groups. Just as you start to understand the daily rhythm of march and rest, the schedule changes. The Mongols understand that disoriented people are easier to control than those who can predict what comes next. Sleep deprivation becomes a weapon as effective as any sword. You're allowed just enough rest to keep you functional, but never enough to think clearly or plan effectively. The guards wake you at random intervals throughout the night, sometimes for legitimate reasons like moving camp, sometimes just to reinforce their absolute control over every aspect of your existence. After weeks of this treatment, your mind begins to operate in a permanent fog of exhaustion. The food rationing serves multiple purposes beyond simple cost effectiveness. You're given just enough nutrition to prevent death, but chronic hunger makes you weak, compliant, and obsessed with your next meal. The Mongols have discovered that hungry people think about food instead of freedom. They think about their next portion instead of escape plans. They compete with fellow captives for scraps instead of cooperating against their captors. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of the psychological conditioning is the way your captors create artificial hierarchies among the slaves. Some women are designated as group leaders, given slightly better food and minor privileges in exchange for reporting on the others. Some are assigned to help with the daily management of the chain gang, creating the illusion that they have some measure of power or status. These small distinctions become enormously important when you have nothing else. You watch as women you once respected begin to inform on friends who whisper about escape. You see mothers report their own daughters for hoarding crumbs of bread. The artificial scarcity of basic human dignity creates a competition where everyone becomes both victim and victimizer. The Mongols don't need to constantly supervise their captives because the captives are supervising each other. The sexual exploitation follows its own calculated pattern. It's not random violence or uncontrolled lust. It's systematic conditioning designed to reinforce your complete powerlessness. The timing is deliberate. You're violated when you're at your weakest, when resistance seems most futile. The location is chosen for maximum psychological impact. Often it happens in front of other captives, reinforcing everyone's helplessness while creating shame and isolation among the victims. The Mongols understand that sexual trauma doesn't just affect the immediate victim. It terrorizes everyone who witnesses it. It creates a climate of fear where the threat of rape hangs over every interaction. Women begin to police their own behavior, trying desperately to avoid any action that might draw unwanted attention from the guards. This self-censorship becomes another form of control that requires no additional effort from the captors. Your body begins to betray you in ways that go beyond simple physical abuse. The constant stress triggers hormonal changes that affect your menstrual cycle, your digestion, your sleep patterns. Many women stop menstruating entirely, their bodies shutting down non-essential functions to conserve energy for survival. Others develop chronic pain conditions that have no visible cause, but create constant discomfort that makes every movement a reminder of your captivity. The Mongols have also learned to exploit cultural and religious differences among their captives. Christian women are forced to participate in shamanic rituals. Muslim women are made to handle pork and alcohol. Traditional dietary restrictions and religious observances are deliberately violated, not just as punishment, but as a systematic attack on personal identity. When you can no longer follow the basic practices that defined your relationship with the divine, you lose another connection to your former self. Language becomes another battlefield in the war for your identity. You're forbidden to speak your native tongue, except when absolutely necessary for work assignments. Conversations in your own language are punished severely. Gradually, you find yourself thinking in the broken mixture of Mongol and trade languages that becomes the common tongue of the slave columns. As your ability to express complex thoughts in your mother tongue fades, you lose access to memories and concepts that can only exist in that linguistic framework. The medical care, such as it is, serves the same dehumanizing purpose as everything else in the system. You're treated when injury or illness threatens your market value, but the care is purely mechanical. No one asks about your pain or discomfort unless it affects your ability to work. Wounds are bandaged to prevent infection, but no effort is made to minimize scarring that might reduce your sale price. Pregnancies are monitored to ensure the birth of healthy slaves, but maternal comfort or safety is irrelevant. Women who become pregnant face a particularly cruel form of psychological torture. They know their children will be born into slavery, that they will never be able to protect or properly care for them. Yet the maternal instinct remains strong, creating an internal conflict between love for the unborn child and despair at the life that awaits them both. Many pregnant captives are forced to work until the moment of delivery, giving birth in slave markets, work camps, or along the march routes. The children born into this system represent the ultimate success of Mongol psychological conditioning. They know no other life. They accept slavery as natural and normal. They often develop stronger loyalties to their Mongol owners than to their birth mothers, who are just fellow slaves with no power to protect or provide for them. These children become living proof that human beings can be conditioned to accept any circumstances as inevitable. But the conditioning process isn't perfectly effective, and the Mongols know it. They maintain elaborate systems of surveillance and punishment designed to catch and crush any signs of resistance before they can spread. Informants are planted among the slave populations. Random searches uncover hidden possessions or evidence of escape planning. Public punishments serve as object lessons for anyone considering defiance. The punishments themselves are calibrated for maximum psychological impact. They're severe enough to terrorize, but not so extreme as to damage valuable property unnecessarily. A woman caught planning escape might have her feet severely beaten, making walking painful but not impossible. Someone caught stealing food might be forced to watch while their daily ration is fed to dogs. The message is always the same. Resistance is futile and will only make your suffering worse. Yet some women do resist, despite the overwhelming odds against success. They develop subtle forms of sabotage that are difficult to detect or prove. They create hidden networks of communication that allow them to share information and provide emotional support. They maintain secret religious practices that help preserve their sense of identity and connection to something beyond their immediate circumstances. These acts of resistance are usually small and seemingly insignificant. A woman might deliberately work slowly when she thinks she's unobserved. Someone might share her food with a weaker captive, despite the risk of being caught. Others maintain mental practices like prayer or meditation that help them preserve some inner space that their captors cannot touch. These tiny acts of defiance rarely change material circumstances, but they represent crucial victories in the battle for psychological survival. The slave markets themselves are designed as theaters of degradation where the dehumanization process reaches its culmination. You're displayed like livestock, your body examined by potential buyers who discuss your strengths and weaknesses in your presence, as if you cannot understand their words. Your personal history, your skills, your potential for various forms of exploitation are reduced to a few lines of description that might be attached to your neck like a price tag. Different markets specialize in different types of human merchandise. Some focus on domestic servants, others on agricultural workers, still others on sexual slaves. The buyers are specialists who know exactly what they're looking for and how to evaluate it. They check your teeth to estimate your age and general health. They examine your hands to determine what kind of work you've done. They assess your physical development and bearing to gauge your suitability for various forms of sexual exploitation. The sale process itself is conducted with the same commercial formality as any other transaction. Prices are negotiated based on market conditions, seasonal demand, and the specific characteristics of the merchandise. Payment might be in silver, in goods, or in other slaves. Bills of sale are written and signed. Ownership is transferred with the same legal procedures used for horses or cattle. Your new owner takes possession of you with the casual efficiency of someone who has made many similar purchases. You might be chained immediately and marched to a new location, or you might be branded or tattooed to mark your ownership status. Some buyers examine their new purchases more thoroughly once the transaction is complete, checking for hidden defects or undisclosed problems that might affect the slave's value or utility. The transportation to your final destination often involves another long journey, but this time as individual property rather than part of a large slave column. The dynamics are different, but no less dehumanizing. Your owner might travel with other merchants or slaveholders, and conversations about the care and management of human property become part of the social interaction. You learn about the experiences of other slaves through these discussions, understanding that your suffering is neither unique nor temporary. Some destinations are marginally better than others, but the fundamental reality remains unchanged. You are property. Your owner has absolute authority over every aspect of your existence. Your labor, your body, your time, your thoughts if they could be controlled, all belong to someone else. The specific form your exploitation takes might vary, but the essential relationship of owner and owned remains constant. In agricultural settings, you might work in fields growing crops that will feed free people while you subsist on scraps and leftovers. In urban environments, you might serve in wealthy households, maintaining the comfort of families while your own family remains scattered across the empire as property of strangers. In military contexts, you might serve the needs of soldiers who are themselves conquering new territories and creating new populations of slaves. The reproductive exploitation of female slaves represents perhaps the most systematically dehumanizing aspect of the entire system. Women are bred like livestock, their pregnancies planned, and managed to produce children with desired characteristics. Some owners maintain detailed records of bloodlines, attempting to develop strains of slaves with particular physical or mental traits. The children produced by these breeding programs belong entirely to the owners, with no recognition of any relationship between the biological parents and their offspring. The psychological impact of this reproductive control extends far beyond the immediate trauma of forced pregnancy and childbirth. Women lose the most fundamental aspect of human autonomy, the ability to make decisions about their own bodies and their own families. They become living incubators for the production of the next generation of slaves, valued primarily for their biological functions rather than as complete human beings. Many women in this situation develop complex psychological coping mechanisms that allow them to survive emotionally while their bodies are being systematically exploited. Some create elaborate fantasy worlds where their children are free and their own suffering has meaning. Others become completely detached from their physical selves, experiencing pregnancy and childbirth as something happening to someone else. A few find ways to maintain emotional connections with their children, despite the system's attempts to prevent bonding. The children born into slavery from captive mothers occupy a particularly tragic position in the social hierarchy. They are often more valuable than their mothers because they can be trained from birth for specific roles and will never know freedom as a lost condition to be mourned. Yet they also represent a form of hope for their mothers, the possibility that something good might emerge from the horror of their circumstances. The Mongol slave system creates entire generations of people who exist in liminal spaces between cultures, between identities, between the human and inhuman treatment they receive from different parts of society. These individuals often develop survival skills and psychological adaptations that would be remarkable in any other context, but their very existence represents the success of a system designed to destroy human dignity and autonomy. The economic calculations that drive the entire system become visible in the day-to-day management of slave populations. Owners constantly balance the cost of maintaining their human property against the value of the labor or services those slaves can provide. This creates incentives to extract maximum productivity while investing minimal resources in the health, comfort, or welfare of the slaves themselves. The result is a carefully calibrated level of suffering that maximizes profit while maintaining just enough human functionality to preserve the value of the investment. Slaves are fed enough to work, but not enough to be healthy. They are housed well enough to survive, but not well enough to be comfortable. They receive medical attention when it protects the owner's financial interests, but not when it would simply reduce their pain or improve their quality of life. This economic logic pervades every aspect of the slave experience, creating a world where human needs are always secondary to financial considerations. The irony is that this system often produces less total value than it destroys, but the benefits are concentrated among the slaveholders, while the costs are borne entirely by the enslaved populations. The result is a massive transfer of wealth from the conquered to the conquerors, built on the systematic extraction of value from human lives. The cultural impact of the Mongol slave system extends far beyond its immediate economic effects. Entire civilizations lose their most productive members, their young women and children, their skilled artisans, and knowledgeable elders. The cultural knowledge that these individuals carry with them disappears from their home communities and is rarely preserved in their new locations as slaves. Languages die when their speakers are scattered across continents as property of people who have no interest in preserving linguistic diversity. Artistic traditions disappear when the artists who might have passed them on to the next generation are working as field slaves, thousands of miles from their homes. Religious practices are lost when the priests and practitioners who maintained them are killed in the initial conquest or absorbed into foreign communities where their expertise is irrelevant. The cumulative effect is a form of cultural genocide that operates through the mechanism of slavery rather than direct extermination. The targeted populations are not necessarily killed, but their ability to maintain and transmit their distinctive cultural characteristics is systematically destroyed. The result is the same: the disappearance of ways of life that had developed over centuries or millennia of human experience. This process creates a world that is culturally impoverished despite its political unification under Mongol rule. The diversity of human knowledge and experience that existed before the conquests is replaced by a more homogeneous system that serves the administrative and economic needs of the empire, but offers far less richness and variety in terms of human cultural achievement. The psychological techniques developed by the Mongols for managing large slave populations become part of their lasting contribution to human knowledge, though it is knowledge that serves only the interests of those who wish to exploit and control other human beings. These methods are refined and passed down through generations of slaveholders, eventually forming the foundation for later systems of human trafficking and exploitation that continue to the present day. The efficiency of Mongol psychological conditioning lies in its systematic approach to breaking down human resistance and rebuilding behavior patterns that serve the interests of the slaveholders. This process is not accidental or haphazard. It represents the accumulated wisdom of generations of people who have made their living by reducing other human beings to property. Yet even the most sophisticated systems of control cannot completely eliminate human resistance and resilience. Throughout the Mongol Empire, enslaved people find ways to preserve elements of their identity, to maintain connections with each other, and to pass on knowledge and traditions to their children, despite the overwhelming pressure to abandon their past and accept their status as property. These acts of preservation and resistance rarely change the immediate circumstances of the enslaved individuals, but they represent victories in a longer struggle for human dignity and cultural survival. The stories, songs, and practices that survive the slave experience become testimony to the resilience of the human spirit and the inability of any system, no matter how sophisticated, to completely destroy the essential humanity of its victims. The legacy of the Mongol treatment of captive women extends far beyond the immediate historical period. The techniques and attitudes developed during this era influenced the development of slavery and human trafficking systems throughout the world. The industrial approach to human exploitation, the systematic use of sexual violence as a tool of control, and the sophisticated methods of psychological conditioning all become part of the dark inheritance that shapes human societies for centuries to come. Understanding this history becomes essential for recognizing similar patterns in contemporary forms of human trafficking and exploitation. The basic dynamics of power, control, and dehumanization remain remarkably consistent across different historical periods and cultural contexts. The specific details may change, but the fundamental structure of systems designed to reduce human beings to property shows surprising continuity from the Mongol period to the present day. The women who survived the Mongol slave system carry their experiences forward in ways that affect not only their own lives, but the lives of their descendants. The trauma of systematic dehumanization becomes embedded in family histories and cultural memories, influencing how entire communities understand their relationship to power, authority, and personal safety. These effects ripple forward through generations, creating patterns of behavior and belief that may seem mysterious to those who do not understand their historical origins. The scale of the Mongol slave system means that its effects are not limited to a few isolated communities, but spread across entire continents and multiple civilizations. The genes, cultures, and memories of enslaved women become part of the foundational history of populations from Eastern Europe to East Asia. The children and grandchildren of captive women carry forward both the resilience that allowed their ancestors to survive and the trauma that shaped their early experiences. This creates a complex legacy where the descendants of both slaveholders and enslaved people must grapple with the historical reality of systematic human exploitation on an unprecedented scale. The wealth and power that some families and communities built on the foundation of slave labor remains part of their inheritance, while the communities that provided that enslaved labor continue to deal with the long-term effects of having their most productive members systematically removed and exploited. The Mongol approach to managing captive women becomes a template that influences the development of slavery systems throughout the world. The techniques for psychological conditioning, the methods for organizing large-scale human trafficking operations, and the legal and social frameworks that support the treatment of human beings as property all show the influence of innovations first developed during the Mongol conquests. Yet the story of captive women under the Mongols is not only a story of victimization and suffering, it is also a story of human resilience, of the ways people adapt to impossible circumstances and find meaning even in the midst of systematic dehumanization. The women who survived these experiences and passed on their stories, genes, and cultural knowledge to future generations demonstrate the inability of any system, no matter how sophisticated, to completely destroy human dignity and cultural identity. Their legacy challenges us to recognize both the terrible capacity of human beings for cruelty and exploitation and their equally remarkable capacity for survival. resistance, and the preservation of hope under the most difficult circumstances. Understanding this history becomes essential for anyone who wishes to understand the full range of human experience and the ongoing struggle between systems that seek to control and exploit human beings and the resilient spirit that refuses to be completely conquered. The industrial scale of the Mongol slave system represents a turning point in human history, the moment when the exploitation of human beings becomes systematized and globalized in ways that prefigure many of the darkest aspects of the modern world. Yet it also represents a testament to human survival and the continuation of cultural and genetic lineages, despite systematic attempts to destroy them. In the end, the story of captive women under the Mongols becomes part of the larger story of human civilization itself, a reminder that progress and development often come at terrible costs borne disproportionately by those who have the least power to resist. Understanding this history does not diminish the horror of what happened, but it does provide context for understanding how societies can develop systems that treat some human beings as less than human, while maintaining the fiction that they represent civilized and advanced forms of social organization. The voices of the women who experience these systems directly are largely lost to history, but their experiences live on in the genetic, cultural, and psychological inheritance of their descendants. Their stories, preserved in fragments and echoes, remind us that behind every historical statistic of conquest and empire building lie individual human experiences of loss, trauma, survival, and resilience that deserve to be remembered and understood. Script continues, type continue, or just hit enter. The processing centers are where the Mongol efficiency truly reveals itself. You arrive at what looks like a military camp crossed with a livestock market, complete with pens, sorting areas, and administrative buildings that hum with the constant activity of human accounting. The Mongols have turned the management of captive populations into a precise science, and you're about to experience every step of their methodology. Your group is herded into holding pens made of wooden stakes and rope barriers. The smell hits you immediately: unwashed bodies, human waste, and the metallic tang of fierce sweat mixed with something else you can't quite identify. Later you realize it's the smell of despair, a specific odor that clings to places where hope goes to die. The ground beneath your feet is churned mud mixed with things you don't want to think about. The first stage is what the Mongols call inventory. Guards move through the pens with wooden tablets covered in strange markings, recording details about each captive with the same attention they might give to counting horses or sheep. They examine your teeth, check your hands for calluses that might indicate useful skills, and assess your physical condition with the practiced eye of livestock dealers. You watch as they separate captives into different categories. Young children under 10 go into one pen. They'll be raised as Mongols, their original identities erased through systematic indoctrination. Elderly captives are led away to a separate area, and you never see them again. The sounds that drift from that direction suggest their usefulness has been deemed too limited to justify the cost of feeding them. Women between 12 and 40 are further subdivided based on appearance and perceived market value. The Mongols have developed a complex classification system that takes into account not just physical attractiveness, but ethnicity, apparent health, and signs of useful skills. They know which characteristics are prized in different slave markets across their empire, and they sort their human inventory accordingly. The administrative efficiency is terrifying in its thoroughness. Scribes record every detail in ledgers that track the movement of human cargo across continents. Your height, weight, estimated age, ethnic background, apparent skills, and physical condition are all noted in a system of any modern corporation record keeping that rivals. You are assigned a number that will follow you through the entire process, tattooed onto your shoulder with a heated iron that leaves you screaming and branded like cattle. The psychological conditioning intensifies during the processing phase. You're deliberately kept hungry, cold, and uncomfortable, while bureaucrats decide your fate with casual indifference. Guards walk through the pens randomly selecting women for immediate use, reinforcing the message that your body belongs to anyone with sufficient authority to claim it. The arbitrary nature of these selections creates an atmosphere of constant anxiety where no one ever feels safe. The medical examinations are conducted with the same impersonal efficiency as everything else in the system. A Mongol physician examines you for signs of disease or physical defects that might affect your market value. The examination is thorough and invasive, conducted without any consideration for your dignity or comfort. Women found to have sexually transmitted infections are marked for disposal, while those showing signs of pregnancy are moved to special holding areas for breeding stock. The Mongols have learned that different markets have different preferences, and they've developed expertise in preparing their human merchandise accordingly. Women destined for Islamic territories are examined for signs of previous sexual activity, as virginity commands premium prices in those markets. Those headed for Chinese territories are evaluated for their potential as domestic servants or concubines in wealthy households. European markets prefer women who can be trained for specialized domestic tasks. During your weeks in the processing center, you witness the full scope of Mongol human trafficking operations. Caravans arrive regularly from different conquered territories, bringing fresh captives to be sorted and prepared for transport. Other caravans depart just as regularly, carrying processed slaves to markets across the known world. It's a continuous flow of human misery that operates with industrial efficiency. The guards who supervise the processing centers are themselves often former slaves who have been promoted, based on their willingness to brutalize their former companions. These individuals understand exactly what you're experiencing because they've survived it themselves, which makes their casual cruelty even more psychologically devastating. They know which methods of intimidation are most effective because they remember how those same methods affected them. You learn to recognize the different categories of guards and administrators. Some are career slavers who have made their living in human trafficking for decades. Others are Mongol soldiers earning extra income during periods between military campaigns. A few are local collaborators who have chosen to work with the conquerors rather than risk becoming victims themselves. All of them treat their work as routine employment, discussing the processing of human beings with the same casual professionalism they might apply to any other job. The preparation for transport involves another level of systematic dehumanization. Your hair is cut short to reduce the risk of lice infestations during long journeys. You're given a single set of rough clothing designed for durability rather than comfort. Any personal possessions you might have retained are confiscated and destroyed. Even small items like religious tokens or family mementos are taken away to eliminate connections to your previous identity. The feeding schedule during processing is carefully calculated to maintain your health while reinforcing your dependence on your captors. You receive one meal per day, consisting of thin gruel and scraps of bread that provide just enough nutrition to prevent starvation. The irregular timing of meals creates additional stress and prevents you from establishing any sense of routine or control over your environment. Water is provided through a system of communal troughs that force you to compete with other captives for access. The water is often contaminated and tastes of metal and algae, but you drink it anyway because dehydration is worse than the risk of illness. The degrading nature of drinking from animal troughs serves the dual purpose of providing necessary hydration while reinforcing your status as livestock rather than human beings. The sleeping arrangements in the processing centers are designed to prevent rest and recovery. You're packed into overcrowded shelters that provide minimal protection from weather while maximizing the number of people who can be housed in a given space. The lack of privacy means that basic bodily functions become public humiliations, further breaking down your sense of personal dignity and individual identity. Disease spreads rapidly through the crowded conditions of the processing centers. You watch as women develop fevers, dysentery, and respiratory infections that go untreated unless they threaten to spread to more valuable captives. The sick are often moved to isolation areas where they're left to recover or die without medical attention. The constant presence of illness creates another layer of stress and anxiety that weakens resistance to psychological conditioning. The Mongols used the processing period to begin breaking down linguistic and cultural bonds among captives. You're forbidden to speak your native language and punished severely for any attempt to maintain religious practices or cultural traditions. Guards who understand various local languages are specifically assigned to overhear and report conversations that might indicate resistance or planning for escape. The psychological impact of witnessing the processing of other captives becomes part of your own conditioning. You see young girls barely into puberty being examined and categorized for sexual slavery. You watch as mothers are permanently separated from their children, creating scenes of desperate grief that haunt your dreams. You observe the systematic destruction of families and communities as people are sorted into different categories based on their economic utility. Some women attempt suicide during the processing phase, unable to cope with the reality of their situation and the certainty of what awaits them. These attempts are usually unsuccessful due to the constant supervision and the removal of any objects that might be used for self-harm. Women who survive suicide attempts are often subjected to additional punishments designed to discourage others from similar acts of desperation. The economic calculations that drive the entire system become visible during the processing phase. You overhear conversations between administrators about market conditions in different regions, seasonal variations in demand for different types of slaves, and the relative profitability of various transportation routes. Your human suffering is discussed in purely financial terms, with no acknowledgement of your existence as a thinking, feeling person. The transportation preparation involves decisions about which captives will be chained together for the journey to market. The Mongols have learned that certain combinations of people are more likely to attempt escape or resistance, while others tend to be more compliant and manageable. They deliberately mix people from different ethnic and linguistic backgrounds to prevent communication and cooperation among captives. The psychological conditioning during processing includes exposure to the fates that await different categories of slaves. You're forced to witness the departure of previous groups, seeing how they're loaded onto wagons or formed into chain gangs for transport to distant markets. These demonstrations serve as object lessons about the futility of resistance while providing specific information about the various forms of exploitation that might await you. The guards use sexual violence strategically during the processing phase, not just as personal gratification, but as a tool for breaking down resistance and establishing complete psychological dominance. The timing and selection of victims is calculated to maximize the psychological impact on all captives, creating an atmosphere of terror that makes active resistance seem impossible and passive compliance seem like the only rational choice. The processing centers also serve as gathering points for intelligence about conquered territories and potential future targets. Captives are questioned about the defenses, resources, and populations of their home regions. This information is recorded and passed on to military commanders planning future campaigns. Your knowledge of your homeland becomes another resource to be extracted and exploited by your captors. The final stage of processing involves the assignment of captives to specific transportation groups headed for different markets. This assignment process takes into account market demand, seasonal transportation routes, and the specific characteristics of individual captives. Once assigned, you're moved to departure staging areas where you wait for the formation of complete caravans. The departure staging areas are designed to reinforce the finality of your situation. You're now clearly labeled property of the Mongol Empire, marked with brands and documentation that establishes your legal status as a slave. Any remaining hope of rescue or return to your previous life is systematically crushed through exposure to the vast scale and efficiency of the slave trading network. The psychological preparation for departure includes final conditioning designed to ensure compliance during transport. You're exposed to examples of what happens to slaves who attempt escape or resistance during the journey to market. These examples are usually provided through public punishment of captives from previous groups who are recaptured after escape attempts. The economic value calculations that determine your final destination become clear during the departure phase. Higher value captives are assigned to more secure and expensive transportation methods, while those deemed less valuable are loaded onto basic wagons or forced to walk in chain gangs. The level of security and care you receive during transport is directly proportional to your assessed market value. The transportation routes themselves are well-established networks that have been developed over decades of slave trading. The Mongols maintain way stations, supply depots, and security checkpoints along these routes to ensure the safe delivery of their human cargo to market destinations. The infrastructure required to support this level of human trafficking represents a massive investment in the systematic exploitation of conquered populations. As you're loaded onto the transport vehicles or formed into marching groups, the reality of your situation reaches a new level of clarity. You're no longer a person who has been captured and is being held temporarily. You're now merchandise being shipped to market with all the legal, social, and psychological implications of that status. Your transformation from human being to property is complete. The departure from processing centers marks the beginning of what might be the final phase of your journey as a free-thinking individual. The transportation process itself is designed to complete the psychological conditioning that began with your initial capture. By the time you reach your final destination, the Mongols intend for you to be completely broken as an independent person and ready to accept whatever role you're assigned in their empire. The efficiency of the processing system means that thousands of captives are handled simultaneously at each center, creating an industrial scale of human suffering that defies comprehension. The Mongols have essentially created factories for converting free people into slaves, with production quotas, quality control measures, and distribution networks that rival any commercial enterprise. Yet even within this system of systematic dehumanization, individual human resilience occasionally manifests itself. Some women find ways to maintain their sense of identity and dignity despite the overwhelming pressure to surrender their humanity. These acts of resistance are usually small and subtle, but they represent crucial victories in the struggle to preserve something essentially human in the face of systematic attempts to destroy it. The processing centers represent the peak of Mongol innovation in human trafficking, combining psychological conditioning, administrative efficiency, and economic calculation in a system that maximizes the extraction of value from conquered populations, while minimizing the costs of maintaining and transporting large numbers of captives. It's a system so effective that its basic principles continue to influence human trafficking operations to the present day. The legacy of these processing centers extends far beyond their immediate historical period. The techniques developed here for managing large populations of captive people become part of the toolkit used by later slave traders, prison administrators, and others whose work involves the systematic control of human beings. The psychological methods, administrative procedures, and logistical innovations pioneered by the Mongols establish precedents that shape the development of institutional control systems for centuries to come. The human cost of this efficiency is measured not just in individual suffering, but in the loss of entire cultures and ways of life. The processing centers serve as filters that strip away cultural identity, linguistic diversity, and traditional knowledge, replacing them with the homogenized compliance required for effective slave management. The result is a form of cultural genocide that operates through the mechanism of forced migration and systematic re-education rather than direct extermination. Understanding the operation of Mongol processing centers provides insight into the industrial nature of historical human trafficking and the sophisticated systems that were developed to manage the exploitation of conquered populations. It also demonstrates the remarkable human capacity for creating efficient systems for terrible purposes, and the equally remarkable capacity of individuals to maintain their humanity even under the most dehumanizing circumstances. The women who passed through these processing centers carried their experiences forward in ways that affected not only their own lives, but the lives of their descendants for generations. The trauma of systematic processing and dehumanization became embedded in family histories and cultural memories, influencing how entire communities understood their relationship to power, authority, and personal safety. The genetic, cultural, and psychological legacy of the Mongol slave system continues to influence populations across multiple continents, creating connections and influences that span centuries and help explain patterns of cultural development that might otherwise seem mysterious. The processing centers also represent a crucial link in the chain of causation that connects the military conquests of the Mongol armies to the long-term cultural and genetic changes that resulted from their empire-building activities. Without the systematic processing and redistribution of captive populations, the Mongol conquests would have remained localized military events rather than transformative historical forces that reshaped entire continents. The scale and efficiency of the processing system also demonstrates the extent to which the Mongol Empire was built on the systematic exploitation of human resources extracted from conquered territories. The wealth and power that supported Mongol military activities and administrative systems depended heavily on the labor and reproductive capacity of enslaved populations, making human trafficking a crucial component of imperial expansion rather than a side effect of military conquest. The transportation networks that carried processed slaves from the centers to their final destinations represent another marvel of Mongol organizational capability. These networks spanned thousands of miles and connected markets across multiple continents, requiring sophisticated logistical coordination and substantial infrastructure investment. The ability to move large numbers of people across such vast distances while maintaining their market value required innovations in transportation, security, and supply management that influenced the development of trade networks throughout the medieval period. The economic impact of the slave processing system extended far beyond the immediate profits generated by individual transactions. The systematic extraction of productive population from conquered territories created long-term economic disruption that affected regional development for centuries. Communities that lost their young adults and skilled workers to the slave system often never recovered their previous levels of economic productivity, creating lasting changes in settlement patterns and economic relationships. The processing centers also served as points of cultural mixing, where people from different backgrounds were brought together under conditions of extreme stress and shared suffering. These interactions created new forms of cultural synthesis and adaptation as people developed survival strategies that drew on multiple cultural traditions. The children born from relationships formed in these environments often became carriers of hybrid cultural knowledge that influenced the development of new communities throughout the Mongol Empire. The administrative records maintained at the processing centers provide historians with detailed information about population movements, economic relationships, and cultural interactions during the Mongol period. These records, when they survive, offer insights into the scale and systematization of human trafficking that would be impossible to obtain from other sources. They also demonstrate the extent to which the Mongol Empire maintained detailed documentation of its human resources, treating enslaved populations as carefully managed assets rather than temporary acquisitions. The medical and health impacts of the processing system extended far beyond the immediate effects of poor living conditions and psychological stress. The concentration of people from different regions in crowded facilities created ideal conditions for the spread of infectious diseases, leading to epidemic outbreaks that affected not only the captive populations, but also their guards and administrators. These disease outbreaks sometimes disrupted the operation of the processing centers and forced changes in procedures and facilities. The psychological techniques developed in the processing centers for managing large groups of traumatized and resistant people represent innovations in crowd control and behavior modification that influenced later developments in institutional management. The systematic use of uncertainty, arbitrary punishment, and social fragmentation to maintain control over captive populations established methods that were later adapted for use in prisons, military organizations, and other institutions requiring the management of potentially hostile populations. The processing centers also played a role in the development of legal and administrative frameworks for managing slave populations throughout the Mongol Empire. The procedures developed for documenting ownership, tracking movement, and resolving disputes over slave property created precedents that influenced the development of slavery law in later periods and different regions. The environmental impact of maintaining large processing centers in areas that were not naturally suited to support such concentrated populations created ecological disruption that affected local communities for decades. The concentration of human and animal waste, the depletion of local water sources, and the destruction of vegetation for fuel and construction materials created environmental damage that persisted long after the centers were abandoned. The gender-specific aspects of the processing system created particular forms of trauma and exploitation that affected women differently than men. The systematic sexual exploitation, forced breeding programs, and separation from children created forms of suffering that were specifically designed to exploit biological and social characteristics associated with female identity. These gender-specific tortures became part of the template for later systems of sexual exploitation and trafficking. The processing centers represent a crucial component in understanding how the Mongol Empire was able to maintain control over vast territories and diverse populations with relatively small numbers of ethnic Mongol administrators and soldiers. The systematic processing and redistribution of captive populations created networks of dependency and control that extended far beyond the reach of military force alone. The long-term demographic effects of the processing system included not only the immediate redistribution of populations, but also changes in birth rates, survival rates, and genetic mixing that influenced the development of populations throughout the former Mongol territories. The systematic separation of families and communities disrupted traditional patterns of marriage and reproduction, creating new genetic and cultural combinations that affected regional development for centuries. The processing centers also served as training grounds for administrators and guards, who later staffed similar facilities throughout the empire. The expertise developed in managing large populations of captive people became a specialized skill that was transferred to new locations as the empire expanded. This transfer of knowledge and techniques helped standardize the treatment of captive populations across the vast expanse of Mongol territory. The economic calculations that drove the operation of processing centers also influenced broader patterns of Mongol conquest and territorial administration. Regions that were likely to produce valuable slave populations became higher priorities for conquest, while areas with less potential for human trafficking received less attention from Mongol military planners. This created a systematic bias in Mongol expansion patterns that favored areas with dense, sedentary populations over sparsely populated or nomadic regions. The processing centers represent one of the most systematically documented examples of industrial-scale human trafficking in the pre-modern period. The records and archaeological evidence from these facilities provide detailed information about the methods and scale of systematic human exploitation that helps historians understand the true scope and nature of the Mongol impact on world history. The psychological and cultural legacy of the processing centers extends far beyond the immediate victims to influence the development of collective memory and cultural identity among populations throughout the former Mongol territories. The shared experience of systematic processing and exploitation created common elements in the historical memory of diverse populations, contributing to the development of cultural attitudes and practices that persist to the present day. Script continues, type continue, or just hit enter. The real innovation of the Mongol slave system wasn't just its scale. It was the feedback loop they created between conquest and commerce. Every successful raid funded the next expansion. Every new territory provided fresh inventory for the markets. Every slave sold generated revenue that bought better weapons, more horses, additional soldiers. You're not just witnessing human trafficking. You're watching the birth of industrialized warfare funded by human misery. The economic calculations become visible when you see how the Mongols price different categories of captives. A skilled craftsman might be worth 50 sheep. A young woman suitable for domestic service commands the price of 20 horses. A virgin girl from a noble family could trade for enough weapons to outfit an entire squad of warriors. Your body has become a unit of currency in an economy built on systematic exploitation. The market forces that drive this system create perverse incentives throughout Mongol society. Local commanders are rewarded not just for military success, but for the quality and quantity of captives they deliver to processing centers. Soldiers receive bonuses based on the market value of the women they capture. Even camp followers and support staff earn commissions for maintaining the health and appearance of captives during transport. You begin to understand that the Mongol Empire isn't just using slavery as a byproduct of conquest. Slavery is the engine that makes conquest possible. The profits from human trafficking fund the military campaigns that capture more slaves, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of expansion and exploitation that spans continents. Your suffering isn't incidental to Mongol success. It's the foundation of it. The specialization within the slave trade reaches levels that would impress modern business analysts. Some Mongol units focus specifically on capturing children for military training programs. Others target skilled artisans whose knowledge can be exploited in Mongol territories. Still others specialize in acquiring women for breeding programs designed to produce the next generation of slaves. Each unit has developed expertise in identifying, capturing, and preparing their particular type of human merchandise. The transportation networks that carry you toward market represent another marvel of Mongol organization. These routes are maintained with way stations every few days' travel, complete with holding facilities, veterinary services for the horses, and basic medical care for valuable captives. The Mongols understand that damaged merchandise brings lower prices, so they invest in systems to deliver their human cargo in marketable condition. But the journey itself becomes another layer of conditioning designed to break your remaining resistance. The daily routine of march, rest, feeding, and abuse creates a rhythm that gradually erases your sense of individual agency. You learn to respond to commands without thinking, to anticipate the needs of your captors, to compete with other captives for minor privileges. By the time you reach market, you've been trained to behave like the property you've legally become. The psychological techniques used during transport are refined through decades of experience, managing large groups of traumatized people Guards create artificial hierarchies among captives, promoting some to supervisory roles that pit slaves against each other rather than against their captors. They use sleep deprivation, irregular feeding schedules, and random punishments to prevent the formation of resistance networks among the captives. The sexual exploitation during transport serves multiple purposes beyond the immediate gratification of the guards. It establishes clear power relationships, breaks down cultural taboos and personal boundaries, and creates psychological trauma that makes captives more compliant and easier to control. The systematic nature of this abuse ensures that every woman in the transport group understands exactly what resistance will cost her. The Mongols have also developed sophisticated methods for dealing with captives who become too damaged or resistant during transport. Some are sold immediately to local buyers at reduced prices rather than continuing to market destinations where they might bring higher profits. Others are used as examples to discourage resistance among the remaining captives. A few are simply abandoned by the roadside when maintaining them becomes more expensive than their potential market value. The route to market takes you through a landscape that has been transformed by decades of Mongol conquest and slave trading. You pass abandoned villages whose populations have been harvested for the slave markets. You see new settlements populated by Mongol colonists who've used slave labor to establish farms and workshops. The human geography of entire regions has been rewritten by the systematic extraction and redistribution of conquered populations. The way stations along the transport routes have become centers of commerce in their own right. Local traders gather to buy and sell captives who don't meet the standards for major market destinations. Mongol administrators use these facilities to redistribute slaves according to changing market demands. Some captives are held at way stations for weeks or months, while their captors wait for favorable market conditions or specific buyer requests. You witness the casual efficiency with which human lives are bought, sold, and traded like any other commodity. Contracts are negotiated, payment schedules arranged, delivery guarantees provided. The legal frameworks that support these transactions are as sophisticated as those governing any other form of international commerce. Your status as property has been so thoroughly established that questioning it seems as pointless as questioning the weather. The health management of transport groups reflects the same economic calculations that drive every other aspect of the system. You receive just enough medical attention to maintain your market value, but treatment stops at the point where additional investment would not generate proportional returns. Minor illnesses are allowed to run their course unless they threaten to spread to more valuable captives. The feeding schedules during transport are designed to maintain your physical condition while reinforcing your psychological dependence on your captors. Meals are provided at irregular intervals to prevent you from establishing any sense of routine or control over your environment. The quality and quantity of food varies arbitrarily, creating additional stress and preventing you from predicting when your basic needs will be met. The social dynamics within transport groups become another tool for maintaining control over large numbers of potentially hostile captives. The Mongols deliberately mix people from different ethnic and linguistic backgrounds to prevent communication and cooperation. They create artificial scarcities of basic necessities that force captives to compete with each other rather than cooperate against their common oppressors. The guards who supervise transport groups are often former slaves, themselves who have earned their positions through demonstrated loyalty and willingness to brutalize their former companions. These individuals understand the psychology of captivity from personal experience, making them particularly effective at identifying and crushing resistance before it can develop into organized opposition. The documentation that travels with each transport group includes detailed records of every captive's background, skills, and market potential. This information is used by buyers to make purchasing decisions and by Mongol administrators to track the movement of valuable human resources throughout their empire. You've become part of a vast database of human assets that can be searched, sorted, and analyzed according to various criteria. The arrival at major slave markets represents the culmination of a process that began with your initial capture months or years earlier. The market itself is a city within a city, complete with holding facilities, examination areas, auction blocks, and administrative buildings that handle the complex financial and legal transactions involved in large-scale human trafficking. The preparation for sale involves another round of processing designed to maximize your market value. You're cleaned, groomed, and dressed in clothing that highlights your most marketable characteristics. Any obvious signs of abuse or poor treatment are concealed through cosmetics or strategic positioning. The goal is to present you as healthy, compliant, and suitable for whatever purpose potential buyers have in mind. The buyers who examine you represent the full spectrum of demand for slave labor throughout the Mongol Empire and beyond. Some are looking for domestic servants for wealthy households. Others need agricultural workers for large estates. Military contractors seek women to serve the needs of garrison troops. Brothel operators evaluate your potential for sexual exploitation. Each buyer has specific criteria and preferences that reflect the particular market they serve. The auction process itself is conducted with the same commercial formality as any other type of merchandise sale. Your characteristics and capabilities are announced to the assembled buyers. Bidding proceeds according to established rules and procedures. Payment terms are negotiated. Ownership is transferred through legal documents that establish your new master's complete authority over your person and future. The prices you command reflect not just your individual characteristics, but broader economic conditions, seasonal demand patterns, and regional market preferences. A good harvest might increase demand for agricultural workers, driving up prices for physically strong captives. Military campaigns might create demand for camp followers and support personnel. Political changes might affect the relative value of captives from different ethnic or religious backgrounds. The financial instruments that facilitate slave trading have become as sophisticated as those used in any other form of international commerce. Letters of credit allow buyers to purchase captives without carrying large amounts of cash. Insurance policies protect against losses during transport. Futures contracts allow buyers to secure delivery of specific types of slaves at predetermined prices. The legal frameworks that govern slave ownership vary across different regions of the Mongol Empire, but all share the common principle that slaves are property that can be owned, bought, sold, inherited, and disposed of according to the wishes of their masters. These laws have been refined through decades of experience managing large slave populations and resolving disputes over ownership and treatment. The economic impact of slave trading extends far beyond the immediate profits earned by individual transactions. The systematic extraction of productive population from conquered territories creates long-term economic disruption that affects regional development for generations. Communities that lose their young adults and skilled workers often never recover their previous levels of prosperity and cultural achievement. The slave markets themselves become major economic centers that attract merchants, artisans, and service providers from across the known world. The concentration of wealth generated by human trafficking supports the development of banking, manufacturing, and transportation services that serve the broader economy. The profits from slavery flow through multiple levels of society, creating stakeholders who have strong economic incentives to maintain and expand the system. The competition between different slave markets creates pressure for innovation and efficiency improvements that benefit buyers while imposing additional costs on the enslaved populations. Markets compete to offer higher quality merchandise, more reliable delivery, better financing terms, and superior customer service. These improvements come at the expense of slave welfare and survival rates. The seasonal patterns of slave trading reflect the agricultural and military cycles that drive demand for different types of labor. Spring campaigns generate fresh supplies of captives, just as agricultural communities need workers for planting seasons. Harvest time creates demand for temporary labor that can be provided by slaves who are not valuable enough for permanent placement. Winter becomes a time for planning future campaigns and organizing the logistics needed to support them. The geographic distribution of slave markets reflects trade routes, population centers, and regional specializations that have developed over decades of Mongol expansion. Some markets focus on luxury slaves for wealthy households. Others specialize in bulk sales of agricultural workers. Still others serve as transit points where captives are sorted and redistributed according to changing market conditions. The technological innovations that support slave trading include improvements in transportation, security, and communication systems that make it possible to move large numbers of people across vast distances while maintaining their economic value. These innovations often find applications in other sectors of the economy, creating spillover effects that benefit the broader society while increasing the efficiency of human exploitation. The cultural impact of slave trading extends beyond the immediate victims to affect the societies that benefit from enslaved labor. The availability of cheap human labor reduces incentives for technological innovation and economic development. The concentration of wealth in the hands of slave owners creates social inequality and political instability. The normalization of human exploitation corrupts moral and ethical standards throughout society. The international dimensions of Mongol slave trading create diplomatic and economic relationships that span continents and involve multiple cultures and political systems. Trade agreements include provisions for slave transactions. Diplomatic negotiations often involve exchanges of valuable captives. International law develops precedents for resolving disputes over slave ownership and treatment. The administrative challenges of managing a global slave trading network require innovations in record keeping, communication, and quality control that influence the development of bureaucratic systems throughout the Mongol Empire. The need to track thousands of individual captives across multiple markets and transportation routes creates demand for literacy, numeracy, and organizational skills that affect educational priorities and social development. The long-term consequences of Mongol slave trading include demographic changes, genetic mixing, and cultural transmission that affect the development of populations throughout the former empire territories. The systematic redistribution of human populations creates new ethnic and cultural combinations while destroying traditional community structures and cultural practices. The resistance movements that develop in response to systematic enslavement create underground networks and survival strategies that influence the development of opposition to authoritarian rule throughout history. The techniques used by enslaved people to maintain their humanity and cultural identity under extreme oppression provide models for later resistance movements facing similar challenges. The medical and health consequences of large-scale slave trading include the spread of infectious diseases, malnutrition, and psychological trauma that affect not only the enslaved populations, but also the communities that exploit their labor. The concentration of people from different regions in crowded facilities creates ideal conditions for epidemic outbreaks that sometimes affect entire regions. The environmental impact of supporting large slave populations in areas not naturally suited to such concentrations creates ecological disruption that affects local communities for decades. The depletion of natural resources, contamination of water supplies, and destruction of vegetation creates lasting environmental damage that reduces the carrying capacity of affected regions. The educational and cultural consequences of systematic enslavement include the loss of traditional knowledge languages, and cultural practices that represent irreplaceable human heritage. The disruption of normal patterns of cultural transmission between generations creates gaps in human knowledge that affect the development of entire civilizations. The psychological legacy of systematic enslavement affects not only the immediate victims, but also their descendants from multiple generations. The trauma of dehumanization and exploitation creates patterns of behavior and belief that influence family relationships, community structures, and individual development long after the original victims have died. The economic legacy of slave-based wealth accumulation creates lasting inequalities that affect the distribution of resources and opportunities for centuries after the abolition of slavery. The profits generated by human trafficking provide the foundation for family fortunes, institutional endowments, and regional development that continue to influence social and economic relationships in the present day. The legal precedents established by Mongol slave trading influenced the development of property law, international commerce, and human rights concepts throughout subsequent history. The systematic reduction of human beings to property creates legal frameworks that must later be dismantled through political and legal struggles that continue for centuries. The technological and organizational innovations developed to support large-scale human trafficking find applications in other forms of systematic control and exploitation throughout history. The methods used to manage slave populations become templates for later systems of institutional control, including prisons, military organizations, and industrial facilities. The moral and ethical consequences of normalizing human exploitation create cultural attitudes and practices that influence social development long after the end of formal slavery. The acceptance of systematic cruelty as economically necessary creates patterns of thought and behavior that affect how societies respond to other forms of injustice and oppression. But for you, trapped in this vast machinery of human exploitation, these broader historical consequences are abstractions that provide no comfort or hope for escape. Your immediate reality is the daily struggle to survive physical abuse, psychological torture, and systematic dehumanization while maintaining some core of human identity that your captors cannot reach or destroy. The market transaction that determines your final destination is completed with the same commercial efficiency as any other business deal. Money changes hands, documents are signed, ownership is transferred. You belong now to someone you've never seen before, someone who has purchased you for purposes you can only imagine. The legal fiction that you are property rather than a person has become the practical reality that will determine every aspect of your future existence. The journey to your final destination represents the last phase of your transformation from free person to slave. By the time you arrive at your new home, the psychological conditioning will be complete. You will have learned to respond instantly to commands, to anticipate the needs of your superiors, to accept abuse without resistance. The process that began with your initial capture will have succeeded in creating a human being who functions as property. Yet even as the system achieves its goal of reducing you to a controllable asset, something essentially human persists beneath the surface conditioning. The capacity for thought, feeling, and moral judgment that defines human nature cannot be completely eliminated, no matter how sophisticated the techniques used to suppress it. This residual humanity becomes both a source of continued suffering and a foundation for whatever resistance might still be possible. The story of your individual experience as a captive woman in the Mongol Empire is simultaneously unique and representative of millions of similar stories that played out across centuries of systematic human exploitation. Each woman who endured this process was a complete person with her own history, relationships, dreams, and potential contributions to human culture. Each represented an irreplaceable loss to the communities from which she was taken and a tragic waste of human potential. that can never be fully calculated or compensated. The documentation of these experiences, fragmentary and incomplete as it necessarily is, serves as testimony to both the terrible capacity of human beings for systematic cruelty and their equally remarkable capacity for survival under impossible circumstances. The women who lived through the Mongol slave system and somehow preserved their essential humanity represent victories of the human spirit that deserve to be remembered and honored. Understanding this history requires acknowledging both the systematic nature of the exploitation and the individual humanity of each victim. The industrial scale of Mongol human trafficking should not obscure the fact that each transaction involved the destruction of a unique human life and the loss of irreplaceable contributions to human culture and knowledge. The legacy of this system extends far beyond its immediate historical period to influence the development of human societies in ways that are still being discovered and understood. The genetic, cultural, and psychological inheritance of the Mongol slave system continues to affect populations throughout the world, creating connections and influences that span centuries and help explain patterns of human development that might otherwise seem mysterious. The techniques and attitudes developed during this period continue to influence systems of human exploitation and control to the present day. Understanding the historical development of these methods becomes essential for recognizing and resisting their contemporary applications. The fundamental dynamics of power, control, and dehumanization remain remarkably consistent across different historical periods and cultural contexts. The women who experienced the Mongol slave system directly have left few written records of their experiences, but their stories live on in the genetic, cultural, and psychological inheritance of their descendants. Their resilience, creativity, and determination to survive under impossible circumstances represent qualities that continue to influence human development centuries after their deaths. The broader historical significance of the Mongol treatment of captive women extends beyond its immediate impact to influence the development of international law, human rights concepts, and cultural attitudes toward the treatment of vulnerable populations. The recognition that systematic exploitation of conquered peoples represents a form of criminal behavior that violates fundamental human dignity develops partly in response to historical awareness of atrocities like those committed during the Mongol conquests. The scale and systematization of Mongol human trafficking also provides important insights into the relationship between military conquest and economic exploitation. The success of the Mongol Empire depended not just on military prowess, but on the ability to extract maximum economic value from conquered populations through systematic enslavement and exploitation. Script continues. Type continue or just hit enter. The journey to your final destination might last weeks or months, depending on market demand and transportation logistics. You're no longer moving with the vast Mongol war machine. Instead, you're part of a smaller commercial caravan that treats human cargo with the same casual efficiency they'd use for transporting spices or textiles. The daily rhythm becomes a grinding routine of walking, resting, eating inadequate meals, and enduring whatever abuse the guards feel like inflicting. Your new reality settles in during these endless days of travel. The chain connecting you to the other women has worn grooves in your ankle where the iron rubs against bone. The guards speak casually about your eventual sale, discussing your potential market value like farmers debating the merits of different livestock breeds. They know which cities pay premium prices for fair-skinned women, which markets prefer dark hair, which buyers specifically request virgins. The caravan stops regularly at trading posts that have become specialized clearinghouses for human merchandise. These facilities combine the functions of a rest stop, a veterinary clinic, and a used car lot. Guards inspect the captives for signs of illness or injury that might reduce their value. Minor medical problems are treated to protect the investment. Major issues result in immediate sale to local buyers at reduced prices. You watch as women who started the journey with you disappear at these stops, sold to whoever happens to be shopping for slaves that day. A teenage girl from your village is purchased by a merchant who specializes in domestic servants. An older woman skilled in weaving is bought by a textile manufacturer. Each transaction is recorded in ledgers with the same attention to detail you'd expect from any legitimate business operation. The psychological conditioning continues throughout the transportation phase. The guards have perfected techniques for maintaining control over groups of potentially hostile captives without requiring constant supervision. They create artificial hierarchies among the slaves, promoting some to supervisory positions that pit captive against captive rather than against the system itself. You find yourself competing with other women for slightly larger food portions, cleaner water, protection from the worst abuse. The guards encourage this competition because it prevents cooperation and makes escape planning almost impossible. When every other captive might inform on you to improve their own situation, resistance becomes a luxury you can't afford. The sexual exploitation during transport follows, patterns that have been refined through decades of experience managing captive populations. It's not random violence or uncontrolled lust. It's systematic conditioning designed to reinforce your complete powerlessness while providing rewards for the guards who maintain the system. The timing is deliberate, the selection of victims calculated for maximum psychological impact on all captives. The routes your caravan follows have been established over generations of slave trading. The Mongols maintain detailed maps showing not just roads and distances, but also information about seasonal weather patterns, local political conditions, and market demand fluctuations. Your captors know exactly which routes will deliver their human cargo in the best condition for sale. The way stations along these routes have evolved into specialized facilities designed specifically for handling slave caravans. They provide secure holding areas, basic medical facilities, and administrative services needed to maintain the complex documentation that tracks ownership and movement of captives across the empire. These facilities represent massive investments in infrastructure dedicated to human trafficking. The guards who supervise your transport group are professionals who've made careers out of moving human cargo across continents. They understand the psychology of captivity, the logistics of feeding and housing large groups of people, and the security measures needed to prevent escapes or uprisings. Their casual expertise in managing human misery is perhaps more disturbing than outright cruelty would be. The documentation that travels with your group includes not just proof of ownership, but detailed information about each captive's background, skills, and market potential. This paperwork serves multiple purposes. It establishes legal ownership, provides information needed by potential buyers, and creates records that help Mongol administrators track the movement of valuable human resources throughout their empire. The health management during transport reflects the same economic calculations that drive every other aspect of the system. You receive medical attention when illness threatens your market value, but treatment stops at the point where additional investment wouldn't generate proportional returns. The guards maintain supplies of basic medicines not from humanitarian concern, but to protect their commercial investment. The feeding schedules during transport are designed to maintain your physical condition while reinforcing psychological dependence on your captors. Meals arrive at unpredictable intervals, preventing you from establishing any sense of routine or control. The quantity and quality vary arbitrarily, creating additional stress and keeping you focused on immediate survival rather than long-term planning. The sleeping arrangements in temporary camps along the route serve multiple control functions. Captives are chained in positions that prevent coordinated action while allowing guards to monitor the entire group with minimal effort. The discomfort is intentional. Well-rested slaves might have the energy to plan resistance or attempt escape. The landscape you pass through tells the story of decades of Mongol conquest and human trafficking. Abandoned villages mark communities that have been harvested for their human resources. New settlements populated by Mongol colonists demonstrate how enslaved labor is used to establish control over conquered territories. The human geography of entire regions has been rewritten through systematic population transfer. The social dynamics within your transport group become increasingly complex as the journey progresses. Alliances form and dissolve based on perceived advantages. Information becomes currency that can be traded for better treatment or additional food. The guards encourage these internal conflicts because they make collective resistance impossible while providing intelligence about potential troublemakers. The guards themselves represent different aspects of the Mongol slavery system. Some are career slavers who've spent their lives in human trafficking. Others are soldiers earning extra income between military campaigns. A few are former slaves who've earned their freedom through demonstrated loyalty and willingness to brutalize their former companions. Each brings different skills and perspectives to the management of captive populations. The economic relationships that support slave trading become visible during the journey. Local merchants provide supplies to caravans in exchange for opportunities to purchase captives who don't meet the standards for major market destinations. Regional administrators collect taxes and fees from slave traders. Even local communities benefit from the economic activity generated by the constant flow of human merchandise through their territories. The seasonal patterns of slave trading affect every aspect of your transport experience. Spring campaigns generate fresh supplies of captives, just as agricultural communities need workers for planting seasons. Summer travel is easier, but increases the risk of disease outbreaks in crowded conditions. Fall harvests create demand for temporary labor that can be provided by less valuable slaves. Winter forces caravans to shelter in permanent facilities that become centers of slave trading activity. The communication networks that support slave trading operations span the entire Mongol Empire. Messages about market conditions, security threats, and buyer preferences travel faster than the caravans themselves, allowing traders to adjust routes and timing to maximize profits. Your captors receive regular updates about prices in different markets, helping them decide where to sell their human cargo for the best returns. The security measures used to prevent escapes have been refined through decades of experience with captive populations. The chains that bind you are designed to allow necessary movement while making coordinated action impossible. Guard rotations ensure constant supervision without creating predictable patterns that might be exploited. The punishment system for attempted escapes is severe enough to discourage attempts, while not so extreme as to damage valuable merchandise. The legal frameworks that govern slave ownership vary across different regions of the Mongol Empire, but all share common principles that treat enslaved people as property that can be owned, bought, sold, inherited, and disposed of according to the wishes of their masters. These laws have been refined through decades of experience managing large slave populations and resolving commercial disputes. The arrival at major slave markets represents the culmination of a process that began with your initial capture. The market itself is a complex of buildings and facilities designed specifically for the large-scale trading of human beings. Holding areas can accommodate hundreds of captives. Examination rooms allow potential buyers to inspect merchandise thoroughly. Administrative offices handle the complex paperwork involved in transferring ownership of human property. The preparation for sale involves another round of processing designed to maximize your market value. You're cleaned and groomed to present the best possible appearance. Any obvious signs of abuse or poor treatment are concealed through cosmetics or strategic positioning. Clothing is selected to highlight your most marketable characteristics while concealing any physical defects that might reduce buyer interest. The buyers who examine you represent the full spectrum of demand for slave labor throughout the known world. Wealthy households seek domestic servants. Agricultural estates need field workers. Military units require support personnel. Brothel operators evaluate potential for sexual exploitation. Each buyer category has specific preferences and evaluation criteria that reflect the particular uses they have in mind for their human purchases. The examination process itself is designed to provide buyers with complete information about their potential purchases while reinforcing the psychological conditioning that reduces captives to property. You're required to demonstrate physical capabilities, answer questions about your background and skills, and submit to intimate physical inspection that leaves no doubt about your complete powerlessness in the transaction. The auction procedures follow established commercial practices that have been adapted specifically for human merchandise. Your characteristics and capabilities are announced to assembled buyers. Bidding proceeds according to rules designed to ensure competitive pricing while preventing disputes. Payment terms are negotiated based on the buyer's creditworthiness and the seller's urgency to complete the transaction. The prices commanded by different types of captives reflect market forces that operate according to the same economic principles as any other commodity trading. Seasonal demand patterns, regional preferences, and supply conditions all affect pricing. A skilled craftsman might be worth 50 sheep. A young woman suitable for domestic service could command the price of 20 horses. A virgin girl from a noble family might trade for enough weapons to outfit an entire military unit. The financial instruments that facilitate slave trading have evolved to match the sophistication of any international commerce. Letters of credit allow buyers to make purchases without transporting large amounts of currency. Insurance policies protect against losses during delivery. Futures contracts enable buyers to secure specific types of slaves at predetermined prices for delivery at future dates. The completion of sale transactions involves legal procedures that establish your new owner's complete authority over your person and future. Ownership documents are prepared and signed. Payment is transferred through banking systems that span continents. You become the legal property of someone who has purchased you for purposes you can only imagine. The immediate aftermath of sale often involves additional transportation to your final destination. Your new owner might be a local buyer who takes immediate possession, or a merchant who plans to transport you to distant markets for resale at higher prices. The uncertainty adds another layer of psychological stress to an already traumatic situation. The journey to your ultimate destination represents the final phase of your transformation from free person to slave. The psychological conditioning that began with your initial capture reaches completion as you learn to function as the property you've legally become. The process has been designed to break down every aspect of your independent identity while building new behavior, patterns that serve your owner's interests. The facilities where you finally arrive might be agricultural estates, urban households, military installations, or commercial establishments. Each represents a different form of exploitation, but all share the common characteristic that your labor, your body, and your entire existence now belong to someone else. The specific details of your exploitation will vary, but the fundamental relationship of owner and owned remains constant. The integration into your final destination involves learning new routines, understanding your owner's expectations, and accepting your position in whatever social hierarchy exists among the enslaved and free populations. The adjustment process can take months or years, depending on the complexity of your assigned role and your success in adapting to your new circumstances. The long-term prospects for enslaved women in the Mongol system vary widely depending on their owners, their assigned roles, and their ability to navigate the complex social dynamics of slave-owning societies. Some might eventually earn positions of relative privilege within their owner's household. Others face lives of unrelenting exploitation that end in early death from overwork, abuse, or disease. The reproductive exploitation of female slaves represents perhaps the most systematically dehumanizing aspect of the entire system. Your capacity to bear children becomes another resource to be managed and exploited by your owner. Pregnancies are planned and controlled to produce offspring that will serve the owner's economic interests rather than your maternal desires. The children born to enslaved women occupy ambiguous positions in slave-owning societies. They belong entirely to their mother's owner, with no legal recognition of relationships to their biological parents. Some might be raised as domestic servants within their owner's household. Others are sold as soon as they're old enough to be separated from their mothers. A few might eventually earn freedom through exceptional service or special favor. The cultural impact of systematic enslavement extends far beyond the immediate victims to affect entire communities and civilizations. The disruption of normal family structures and cultural transmission creates gaps in human knowledge and tradition that represent irreplaceable losses to human civilization. Languages disappear when their speakers are scattered as slaves. Artistic traditions die when the artists who might have preserved them are working in distant fields or households. The psychological legacy of enslavement affects not only the immediate victims, but their descendants for multiple generations. The trauma of systematic dehumanization creates behavioral patterns and belief systems that influence family relationships and community structures long after the original enslavement has ended. The genetic, cultural, and psychological inheritance of the Mongol slave system continues to influence populations throughout the world. The economic legacy of slave-based wealth accumulation creates lasting inequalities that persist long after the formal end of slavery. The profits generated through human trafficking provide the foundation for family fortunes and institutional endowments that continue to influence resource distribution for centuries. The systematic extraction of wealth from enslaved populations creates regional economic imbalances that affect development patterns throughout the former Mongol territories. The resistance movements that develop in response to systematic enslavement create underground networks and survival strategies that influence later opposition to authoritarian rule. The techniques used by enslaved people to maintain their humanity and cultural identity under extreme oppression provide models for resistance movements facing similar challenges throughout history. The medical and health consequences of large-scale enslavement include the spread of infectious diseases, malnutrition, and psychological trauma that affect entire populations. The concentration of people from different regions in crowded facilities creates ideal conditions for epidemic outbreaks that sometimes spread far beyond the enslaved communities to affect regional populations. The environmental impact of supporting large enslaved populations in areas not naturally suited to such concentrations creates ecological disruption that affects local communities for decades. The depletion of natural resources, contamination of water supplies, and destruction of vegetation creates lasting environmental damage that reduces the productive capacity of affected regions. The legal precedents established through systematic enslavement influence the development of property law, international commerce, and human rights concepts throughout subsequent history. The reduction of human beings to property creates legal frameworks that must later be dismantled through political and legal struggles that continue for generations. The technological and organizational innovations developed to support large-scale human trafficking find applications in other forms of systematic control and exploitation throughout history. The methods used to manage enslaved populations become templates for later systems of institutional control, including prisons, military organizations, and industrial facilities. The moral and ethical consequences of normalizing human exploitation create cultural attitudes and practices that influence social development long after the formal end of slavery. The acceptance of systematic cruelty as economically necessary creates patterns of thought and behavior that affect how societies respond to other forms of injustice and oppression. The international dimensions of Mongol slave trading create diplomatic and economic relationships that span continents and involve multiple cultures and political systems. Trade agreements include provisions for slave transactions. Diplomatic negotiations often involve exchanges of valuable captives. International law develops precedents for resolving disputes over slave ownership and treatment. The administrative challenges of managing a global slave trading network require innovations in record-keeping, communication, and quality control that influence the development of bureaucratic systems throughout the Mongol Empire. The need to track thousands of individual captives across multiple markets and transportation routes creates demand for literacy, numeracy, and organizational skills that affect educational priorities and social development. But for you, experiencing this system as an individual victim rather than a historical phenomenon, these broader consequences provide no comfort or hope for escape. Your daily reality is the immediate struggle to survive while maintaining some core of human identity that your captors cannot reach or completely destroy. The market transaction that determines your fate is completed with routine commercial efficiency. Money changes hands, documents are signed, ownership is legally transferred. You belong now to someone you may never have seen before, purchased for purposes that serve their interests rather than your welfare. The legal fiction that you are property has become the practical reality that will determine every aspect of your future existence. Your new owner takes possession with the casual efficiency of someone making a familiar purchase. You might be immediately chained and transported to your final destination, or you might be held temporarily while your owner completes other business. The specific details matter less than the fundamental reality that your life now belongs entirely to someone else. The journey to your ultimate destination represents the final phase of a process that began with your village's destruction. The psychological conditioning is nearly complete. You've learned to respond instantly to commands, to anticipate the needs and desires of your superiors, to accept abuse without visible resistance. The free person you once were has been systematically destroyed and replaced with a human being who functions as property. Yet something essentially human persists beneath the surface conditioning. The capacity for thought, feeling, and moral judgment that defines human nature cannot be completely eliminated, regardless of the sophistication of the techniques used to suppress it. This residual humanity becomes both a source of continued suffering and the foundation for whatever resistance might still be possible. The story of your individual experience represents one thread in a vast tapestry of human suffering that spans continents and generations. Each woman who endured the Mongol slave system was a complete person with her own history, relationships, dreams, and potential contributions to human culture. Each represented an irreplaceable loss to the communities from which she was taken and a tragic waste of human potential that can never be fully calculated or compensated. The systematic nature of this exploitation should not obscure the individual humanity of each victim. The industrial scale of Mongol human trafficking involved the destruction of millions of unique human lives and the loss of immeasurable contributions to human knowledge, culture, and civilization. Understanding this history requires acknowledging both the systematic nature of the crimes and the individual worth of each person who suffered them. The techniques and attitudes developed during the Mongol period continue to influence systems of human exploitation and control to the present day. The fundamental dynamics of power, dehumanization, and systematic cruelty remain remarkably consistent across different historical periods and cultural contexts. Recognizing these patterns becomes essential for understanding and resisting their contemporary applications. The women who experienced the Mongol slave system have left few direct records of their experiences, but their stories live on in the genetic, cultural, and psychological inheritance of their descendants. Their resilience, creativity, and determination to survive under impossible circumstances represent human qualities that continue to influence development centuries after their deaths. The broader significance of understanding this history extends beyond academic interest to influence contemporary discussions of human rights, international law, and social justice. The recognition that systematic exploitation represents a fundamental violation of human dignity develops partly through historical awareness of atrocities like those committed during the Mongol conquests. So there you are, sold, transported, processed, and delivered to whatever fresh hell your new owner has planned for you. The Mongols didn't just conquer the world. They turned human suffering into the most efficient business model in history. Every woman they captured became fuel for the machine that captured more women. Every slave sold bought the weapons that enslaved more people. It's a feedback loop of misery that spans continents and centuries. And here's the thing that should keep you up at night. This isn't ancient history that we've moved past. The techniques the Mongols perfected for breaking human spirits, for turning people into property, for making victims compete against each other instead of their oppressors. All of that is still happening right now. Different uniforms, different technology, same fundamental cruelty. Sweet dreams.